Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate everybody being here. I am Jerry Ann Albers. I'm the fur bearer biologist for the Indiana DNR, and I'm also the chair-elect for the Hunting, Trapping, and Conservation Working Group of the Wildlife Society. We're a pretty active working group that deals with all issues related to regulated hunting and trapping and conservation and wildlife management. We are interested in topics like non-lead. We just sponsored a non-lead symposium at the last conference. We're interested in recruitment, retention, and reactivation of regulated hunters and trappers. And we're also interested in wildlife management and how all those things interact with each other. And so if those sound of interest to you, feel free to consider becoming a member for our group. We're really happy to be here today. And today we're going to talk about irreplaceable conservation funding, a primer on the Wildlife Restoration Act. This is some ground level legislation that's really important to a lot of us. I'm blind on what the right word were, the foundational legislation that's really important to the funding for a lot of us. Whether you work for a state agency or not, whether you work for a nonprofit, you might have a cost share program that involves this funding. You might work for a university or be a grad student whose research was funded through this type of funding. So we thought it was an important topic to talk about because a lot of folks don't know a ton about it. So we have a great panel here with us today. We're going to go around and let them introduce themselves first. Then we're going to dive into a little background, and then we're going to start taking some questions and answering some questions. So today, one of the people we have with us is Kyle Daly. Kyle, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jerry Ann. My name is Kyle Daly. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program in our Midwest region. So I'm based out of Minnesota. I've been with the program for about 9 years now, following grad school and working in the field for a while. Basically administering Pittman Robertson dollars and some state wildlife grant money to states in the Midwest. I'm also the past president of the Minnesota chapter of the Wildlife Society and a member of the working group here.
Awesome, thank you. Next up, we have Kim Royer. Kim, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jerry Ann. Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Royer. I'm with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I've been with the department this is my 40th year, and I've sort of held many roles in that tenure with the department. I've gone from habitat biologist to fur bearer biologist to deputy commissioner to program leader, and I'm back being the fur bearer biologist again, actually, thankfully. So yeah, spent quite a few years working in the field, and I have enjoyed every minute of it, pretty much.
Awesome. Fur bearer biologists are the best jobs, so I get it. Next with John McDonald. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you. I'm happy to be part of the panel. I'm a professor at Westfield State University, which is a small 4-year public school in Western Massachusetts. And I'm also a board member of this working group and a past president of the Wildlife Society. And I worked in a job similar to Kyle's before with the Fish and Wildlife Service for about 10 years, administering Pittman Robertson and state wildlife grant funds to state agencies. Prior to that, I was a recipient of those funds working for a state agency in Massachusetts and also as a graduate student. And when I was early on in my career, I had very little familiarity with the mechanics of how this program worked, even though I was a pretty direct beneficiary of it. So I'm happy to be helping share a little information today.
Awesome, thank you. And Tom Decker.
Hey, Jerry Ann, thank you. My name is Tom Decker. I'm a wildlife biologist in the WISFR program, similar to Kyle. I have about 10 years in the WISFR program in the federal government. I work out of the Northeast region. Prior to that, I have about 25 years experience with state fish and wildlife agencies. My career track is similar to Kim, as Kim described for her. And in total, I have about 35 years of experience. I'm still not up there where Kim's still ahead of me. But I think between all the panelists here, we have over 100 years experience working in this program familiar with the intricacies and the ins and outs of it. And it sometimes strikes us that people in the program often aren't understanding of the totality of what it does. And then others in our profession just aren't that familiar with it. So we're excited to be here today, just have this conversation and talk more about this program and keeping it as an important part of conserving America's wildlife.
Thank you so much. So the way it's going to work today is we're going to start out with a short presentation from Tom and John. I don't know if you've noticed, but we did bar any panel members who had more than 4 letters in their name. That's why I had to be moderator, because I have 7. So, but Tom and John are going to start out with a short presentation. And then we're going to, as you have questions, you can put them in the question and answer box. And then when their presentation's done, I will start fielding questions to our panel, and we'll start hopefully have a great discussion today. So Tom, you want to get the PowerPoint going and take it away?
Yep. So I'm going to just kick off with an informational video. It's very short. It's about 3 minutes. Because today we're going to talk about the WISFR program, we're going to talk about WISFR funding, and we're going to talk about WISFR partnerships. And those will all become apparent as we go through sort of the narrative of this law and this program. But I just wanted to establish a primer, because it is really a heritage program. It's been around for a long time. So I'm going to share my screen and show this short video. Let's see if I can get us there.
As a nation, it is the places, it is the people, and it is the wildlife that all come together to help define who we are. Together, they help form our American heritage, a conservation heritage built on a foundation that is as strong today as it has ever been, thanks to the manufacturers who supply the funding that make conservation possible. Unbeknownst to many, a percentage of the cost of firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment provide the funding that state and federal fish and wildlife agencies use to conserve our natural resources. A unique aspect to conservation is that the type of craftsmanship and pride that go into making the products in these facilities ultimately support the women and men working to conserve our outdoor way of life. These partnerships between the manufacturers of hunting and shooting supplies and state and federal fish and wildlife agencies have held true for decades, creating the single most concerted effort to conserve wildlife in perpetuity the world has ever seen. Thanks to the work ethic of these women and men, our accomplishments of restoring America's wildlife are anchored in our history, and our capacity to meet the challenges of the future knows no bounds, as our legacy to future conservation is solidified in our commitment to our partners and wild animals in wild places.
So as Tom is switching screens to our slideshow, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the format. So Tom and I are in different states, and we're going to split up the presentation. So he's going to work on the first few slides and then the ending of the presentation, and I'm going to take the middle section. There'll be a little bit of wonkiness as I have to ask him to advance slides. But Tom's going to get us started with a little bit of intro and background on the Pittman-Robertson Act. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics, how it works, and then we'll turn it back over to Tom to wrap it up.
Thanks, John. So again, we're happy you were able to attend with us today. You're going to see this logo that's in the top right of this slide quite often, and maybe you have in your travels where you are. again, this is the panelists here today to help us. I want to really, we're going to talk a lot about this law and program, but I just wanted to give you a quick primer of where it came from. And this will be sort of maybe a little bit familiar to many of you, but what happened to natural resources in this country, culminating in the 1860s to 1930, were extreme degradation, extirpation, and habitat destruction. Sort of universally, it didn't matter what part of the country you were in. This was encapsulated in a book called Man and Nature by George Perkins Marsh in the 1860s, and others began to write on it as well. In the late 1800s, small groups formed. The Boone and Crockett Club formed in 1887. In some states, the Audubon societies began to form, and there was this, I won't call it a groundswelling, but there was interest among various people to address these conservation concerns. By the 1900s, the Lacey Act was passed, and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed shortly after that in the early 1900s. But those early laws didn't actually fund conservation. They began to strengthen conservation laws, but by the 1930s, there was some laws that came about. The Duck Stamp Act actually funded conservation, and the Wildlife Restoration Act of 1937, which is really a lot of what anchors what we're talking about today, came about. And that came about as an excise tax on firearms and ammunition. In 1937, it was passed through a coalition, particularly through the Sporting Arms and ammunition companies, some conservationists, some sportsmen's group. But many people don't know that the legislation actually stalled in the Agriculture Committee, and that garden clubs in Illinois, and these were principally clubs made up of women, were very influential to move the legislation to get it passed at that time through telegrams, intense pressure from telegrams to move the legislation, and it did. So it came into play in 1930s. And interestingly enough, that's when our profession started to blossom. That's when Aldo Leopold started to form. The land-grant universities were around. Cooperative fish and wildlife research came about, and the idea of wildlife biologists, scientists, technicians took hold, because most of the state agencies already had game wardens and they already had fish cultures. So we're going to talk today about the Wildlife Restoration Fund, but a little bit about the Wildlife Restoration Program. That's a division within the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's made up of multiple grant programs. There are many. Some of them are niche related. Some of them cover things that the Wildlife Restoration Act does not cover. But we're only talking about the Wildlife Restoration Program today. It is the largest, and it represents over $1 billion into the federal treasury for conservation just last year. So that's where our focus is, but it is a broader story and a broader grant program. So when we talk about these partnerships, eligibility for the grant funds are the state fish and wildlife agencies or territorial agencies. So that's represented by all these different state agencies, many of whom TWS members work for, the WISPR program and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then when we talk about our industry partners, it's the manufacturers who pay the excise tax, which is a 10 or 11% tax, depending on what industry they're in. And they're represented through archery, ammunition, firearms. And on the sport fish side, which is the parallel to angling, fishing, boating, there are a few other trade organizations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to give us a little more primer about how the mechanics of the act work.
Thanks, Tom. And so right on cue, my daughter just came home, and our dog's probably going to start barking in a second in the background, but bear with me on that. So like many of you, I was an unwitting participant in this program prior to engaging in a wildlife career when I was buying guns and ammunition and archery equipment. And so I was a contributor, like many of you might have been. And it wasn't until I got into my graduate programs when I really understood a little bit about how the program worked, or at least where the funding went, when I started working on my doctoral research here in Massachusetts, I had to write my annual report every year for my advisor, who forwarded that on to the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, who forwarded that on to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I really didn't know where any of that information went or who used it. But I slowly began to realize where all this funding was coming from that supported my research and my education. The Act really was the culmination of some efforts that started or in the 1930 North American or American Game Policy, which recognized funding as an unmet need in wildlife conservation. And so during the 1930s, some momentum built and kind of really came to a head in 1937. And, thinking about it in the context of modern legislation, even though Tom said that the Act was stalled in the Ag Committee, stalled back then was a relative term, right? So the Act was formally introduced into Congress in June of 1937 and was signed into law in September of 1937. So this major piece of conservation funding in the middle of the Great Depression, that was extending this existing excise tax that was supposed to expire in 1938, was passed really in a matter of 2.5 months, went from introduction to having FDR sign it. So it was pretty impressive given how long it takes for anything to happen in our current legislative environment. And it was pretty straightforward. I'm not going to, uncharacteristically, Professor McDonald has notes, and I'm not going to read all the slides, and I'm going to try to stay on time. So I'm not going to read everything on every slide, but it was a pretty simple formula. And it provided a real, an equitable and predictable funding source to state fish and wildlife agencies. So it's a simple formula, 50% based on the amount of land area that a state has relative to the rest of the states, and 50% based on their prior year sale of hunting licenses as a proportion of the total number of hunting licenses sold in the United States. And it set some limits to make sure that everybody was a participant, right? So no state can get more than 5% of the available funds or less than 0.5%. And so even states like where I live in Massachusetts, we're a minimum state. We always get the 0.5%. But that still runs, recently in the range of $6 to $7 million a year just from this one funding source. And it is not a grant that the states just get unconditionally. They have to submit project proposals, and the money is approved based on those projects. So just because a state gets $6.5 million a year that they're eligible for, they have to submit proposals to spend that money. It's just not a block grant that they get all in one lump. Lots of things are eligible. So the Pittman-Robertson funds and the grant proposals have to address things that benefit wild birds and mammals. So it can be any kind of bird or mammal, game or non-game, and a lot of states fund a lot of non-game research and restoration efforts through the Pittman-Robertson Act. And I was amazed when I got into the program and just how much was going on with a whole range of bird and mammal species. It can fund restoration of species or their habitats. It can fund all these other things in terms of research and monitoring. Land acquisition is a huge part of the program, as well as what's called operations and maintenance, or O&M. So states can manage land that they've acquired either with their own dollars or through Pittman-Robertson funds. And then there's a whole range of other things that deal with grant coordination and education, facilitation of shooting ranges, planning, and all kinds of stuff. As well as having a lot of things that are eligible, there are a lot of things that are not eligible per the terms and conditions of the Act. So things that deal with herps or invertebrates are not eligible for funding directly under the Pittman-Robertson Act. Now, when we acquired land or we manage land and habitat, those species do benefit tremendously. But in the grant proposals, the purpose of the expenditure has to be to benefit wild birds and mammals. Things like law enforcement activities are not eligible activities, except in certain circumstances. Things like activities where the state just wants to make money or do pure public relations are not eligible, as well as political activities. So like when I was a state biologist and I was working on creating regulations or talking to legislators or other bodies, that type of work wasn't eligible for funding under the PR Act. Next slide. And so grants are structured in a way where the state has to propose a need and a purpose. They have to state explicit objectives and what the expected results or benefits to the wild birds and mammals and to the state will be. And then they have to describe their methodology. And this is where you know, my role as a biologist in the Fish and Wildlife Service came in, and this is the type of stuff that Kyle and Tom do, working with state biologists to make sure that the proposals are what are called substantial in character and design, and where they're using appropriate methodology and not just repeating things over and over again. And then there are other things that are part of the grant proposals. There's a budget and a budget narrative. So you have to explain how much money you're going to spend and how you're going to spend it. You have to go through a whole range of compliance with the Endangered Species Act, Section 7, with NEPA, with historical preservation laws, comply with a bunch of executive orders, a whole range of other things that go into a complete grant proposal. Most of us on the biology side dealt with the first 5 bullets here. And then there are other people who work in the service who deal with the fiscal side and compliance of things. Next slide. So there we go. No, that's the previous slide. There we go. And so what does what qualifies as substantial in character and design? It's not just up to us on the staff side of things to figure that out, although we have a lot of latitude, but there are regulations that describe what a state has to demonstrate for something to be substantial in character and design. So it has to meet a need consistent with the act. There has to be a real purpose and a set of objectives. And then C is where we get into, you know, the design and the methodology and reviewing that. Making sure that the proposal contains the latest information and has considered the latest methodology, and obviously that it's cost effective, that we're doing things that are going to produce a result for the money that's being approved. Next slide. And every year, the state agencies have to submit an annual performance report, and so these reports contain, you know, a comparison. What did we accomplish over the past year based on compared to what our objectives were? If things didn't go well and we didn't meet our objectives or we didn't hit our goals, we have to describe why that was. And then we say, well, anything other pertinent. Really what we were looking for in these performance reports, as well as along with the results that were obtained, is some consistency between the dollars expended and the effort that went into the grant program. And so, you know, we want to make sure that if you're spending $60,000 or $80,000 on something, there's enough documentation in the annual report to describe why that expenditure was necessary and useful. Next slide, please. And so from those annual reports, we're able to glean all this type of information about how many bird and mammal species have been targeted for restoration and management. So over 500 species of wild birds and mammals nationwide over the history of the program. The program has resulted in the direct acquisition of over 763,000 acres of land and management of over 46, almost 47 million acres of land, either in operations and maintenance or in providing access to that land, as well as contributing to the establishment or improvement of almost 800 shooting ranges. Next slide. And a lot of education. So well over almost 3 million students annually go through hunter or aquatic education of some form that's funded through one of these programs. And in recent years, a lot of grants that are supporting what we now call the R3 initiative are funded through Pittman Robertson and Sport Fish Restoration funds. And like any good piece of federal legislation that's been around for over 80 years, there have been a few key amendments to the act. The first one listed here, the 1951 amendment, made the act what's called a permanent indefinite appropriation. So the act is voluntary, and states, showed their willingness to participate between the time it was passed and by the late 1940s, all the states were participants. But if you know anything about congressional appropriation and federal funds, Congress had to appropriate the money that was collected in the previous year. And so while in any given year, the Fish and Wildlife Service may have had, say, $50 million available to appropriate to the states based on the formula we discussed, Congress might only have appropriated $40 million for that budget year. And so there was a surplus building up in the wildlife restoration account that wasn't being sent out to the states. And that caused a little bit of controversy. And there were some factions who said the act should go away. There were some who said, no, it needed to be strengthened. And the side that wanted it strengthened won out. And in the 1951 budget, the Pittman-Robertson funding was made what's called a permanent indefinite appropriation. So now automatically, all of the money collected in excise taxes in one year is automatically appropriated the following year without having to go through the budget process. So this really makes it a stable and predictable form of funding to state fish and wildlife agencies. And it works no matter whether there's a federal shutdown or not. The funds are still authorized to be expended. So that was a huge amendment that really solidified the place of this act in the conservation landscape. And just to give you a sense of, there are a few other pieces of federal funding that are permanent indefinite appropriations, things like Social Security trust funds, and then some other minor things. So that put it up there in some pretty rarefied air. These other amendments added things or allowed for the expenditure on hunter education programs. The 2000 Improvement Act capped the administrative funds that the Fish and Wildlife Service could spend on this program at a dollar amount and not a percentage of the funds received every year. And so that is now annually adjusted for inflation. That kind of keeps a cap on the number of employees like Tom and Kyle. We don't have a bloated bureaucracy administering the act through the Fish and Wildlife Service just because more money is collected every year. And the recent amendment that authorized a whole wider range of R3 and shooting range activities just passed in 2019. Again, like any good federal legislation, there are some regulations that all sides have to follow. And again, I had said earlier that this is a voluntary program. The states who wish to participate had to assent to the provisions of the act. And so all the states had to pass assent legislation, which guaranteed that a key clause that was added by Willis Robertson, the fellow in the photo there, was that for a state to be eligible to participate, they had to pass a law that prohibits the diversion of license fees paid by hunters for any other purpose than the administration of the state Fish and Game Department. So this includes revenues from permits and stamps and other things that hunters need to buy to legally hunt in their state. And I think the thing I never really appreciated until I got into the program on the federal side was that it also protects things the states acquire with license dollars. So land that a state acquires with license dollars is protected from being used for purposes other than wildlife conservation or hunter access, or equipment that a state agency buys, like vehicles, are prohibited from being used by other state agencies, except in certain circumstances and by mutual agreement. So next slide, please. So all of these funds that state agencies receive from license buyers have to be under their management control. They can't be pooled into the general state fund and then apportioned back to the state Fish and Wildlife Agency by their legislature. They have to remain in the administrative control of the state agency. So those hunting license revenues are protected in that way, as well as the things that states acquire with those revenues. Next slide. Lands as well, right? So lands, either lands that are acquired through the wildlife restoration program directly through a grant, or lands that states acquire from the revenue derived from hunting licenses, have to be under the control of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. Next slide. And so, like any other program, like what happens if we break the rules? What if a state is found to divert funds or lands to some other purpose? And there's a pretty neat section of the federal regulations that deal with that, that says that if a state diverts license revenue, and we can read or things acquired with license revenue from the control of its State Fish and Wildlife Agency, the director now of the Fish and Wildlife Service may declare a state to be in diversion, and then the state is ineligible to receive any future benefits under the act. And so, for example, a state like Pennsylvania, which would be eligible to receive almost $24 million in wildlife restoration funds, if they were found to have diverted license dollars, they would forfeit the ability to receive any of those $24 million, not just on the grant where the diversion occurred, but the entire program that's funded by the Wildlife Restoration Act. And so it rarely gets to that point. States work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to deal with those type of things, but that's the ultimate stick that the service has to deal with it. An example of a diversion is this state prison, which was built on a wildlife management area in Illinois. These diversion issues come up all the time, where one state agency sees a piece of vacant land, where they see a bunch of vehicles sitting in a parking lot, or they see any other type of equipment that a state fish and wildlife agency might have that they might have a use for. And they say, hey, this is a great place to build a prison, or we need those trucks to do this other thing. We'll bring them back eventually. And state fish and wildlife agency directors, have the stick of saying, no, we can't divert those funds to some other purpose. In the case of a real sticky situation, like where this prison was built on a wildlife management area, the state, in order to get out of this potential diversion situation, has to acquire lands. If they're not going to destroy the prison and move it somewhere else and put the land back to the purpose it was acquired for, they have to provide land of equal value in current dollars to the land that was diverted, and they have to do that in the region where the diversion took place. So they can't divert land, in this case, say outside of Chicago, where land values may be really high, and then say, well, we'll buy some land down in southern Illinois where land values are a lot cheaper. It has to occur within the region that's affected. And those things are negotiated between the service and the state through a process. I was involved with one or two of those when I worked there. And it takes a while to work things out, but usually things can be worked out to everyone's advantage. As someone who's sometimes a skeptic of big government myself, having been on all sides of this program, I can tell you there's a lot of accountability. So the states are audited every 6 years by the Office of the Inspector General. They hire an audit, or they send auditors in, and usually there are a few audit findings in every state audit, 3 or 4 on average, although it ranges from 0 in some states to 20 in others. And sometimes those findings, take up are the result of millions of dollars that need to be worked through this corrective action plan. So the states will meet with the auditors and meet with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and will develop a plan to correct whatever the audit findings were and resolve those over a period of time. The Fish and Wildlife Service, the administrative side of the program, is audited every 2 years. And then service employees, like Tom and Kyle, like I used to be, also can conduct field reviews of grant programs. And ideally, that's where you would catch something like a prison being built on a wildlife management area. But you need to know, if you're the service employee going on a field review, you need to know a little bit about what to ask and what sites you want to visit. So a state might not be taking you to the place where a diversion occurred, unless they're really upset about it because it was imposed on them and it wasn't something that was slipped in accidentally. So there's this whole, what we might describe as circle of responsibility, that's a shared thing between The states starts on the ground with the project leaders, people like me. When I was a state fish and wildlife biologist running a deer program, where I really was in a position where I had to appreciate the objectives of the Wildlife Restoration Act funding and what was eligible and what was not, while I was keeping track of my time and while I was proposing new activities. There are coordinators in every state fish and wildlife agency who work both with state staff and with the federal staff to make sure the grant program is running smoothly and everything is eligible and all the compliance documents are in order and the budgets are in order. And then the state directors as well have a role in sharing this responsibility with their staff and also working through AFWA with the federal side of the program. And now Tom's going to take back over.
Thanks, John. So to finish this out, the service does have biologists to give guidance to the states as the project leaders want to develop different kinds of grants. There's written advisories on what we call the wiki, which is a web-based formula or a format platform. For example, we have 26 advisories on R3 grants alone, just what makes projects eligible to help state R3 coordinators, help state biologists, help state land managers. So these are resources for them. As John was talking about, the oversight and the engagement of the Office of Inspector General and the engagement between the state agency and WSFR staff, the industry who's paying these taxes is also keenly aware and want to know where their funding goes to. And so the service does, and the states have programs that get those people out so they can see on the ground benefits of what's happening in communities from these excise taxes. Nobody likes to pay a tax that goes to a black hole and you just sort of wonder as a taxpayer, where did that money go? So here's a couple just quotes. One is from Dan Forster, who is a lead officer in the Archery Trade Association, and the other is from Matt Spafford, who is a communications division specialist with Smith & Wesson, who's a firearms manufacturer. And they've been out in the field, and nobody likes to think, well, an audit is coming, but the people who are actually paying these taxes actually like that kind of oversight. It's not always nice when you're sitting there where Kim's sitting, for example, and auditors show up, but they are really important. So I want to talk real quickly about who we are and we are who, because the transition of the act since 1937 with birds and mammals and the expansion of it over time, the service has really expanded the type of professionals we have to implement the act. And this really mirrors professional job titles and people in the state agencies themselves. And all these people in all these different facets are delivering Wildlife Restoration Act grants on the ground. And it really has broadened, but it consists of highly diverse, skilled teams of people now, both in the state and federal agencies, who intersect and collaboratively make this program happen on the ground. It's a big program, and there's a lot of intricacies to it. So I want to talk to you just briefly about revenue, because the act passed. The basic rate of taxation at 10 or 11% is still the same. What you see here is the numbers that come in from the firearms, ammunition, and archery industries, which are taxed. There's over 44 items that are taxed among those industries. And you'll see last year, 2021, over $1 billion in revenue came into the federal treasury that this year will go out in the form of grants eligibles for states as the states begin to submit it. It is a serious industrial source of funds. And I wanted to just break out here. You can see how much is contributed from different sources. The light blue on the bottom is pistols and revolvers. The darker blue are firearms. The gray is ammunition. Ammunition is the largest portion of items coming in, and 90% of ammunition sold is actually for target shooting. It's not for hunting. Target shooters, both in terms of purchasing firearms and ammunition, are probably the largest contributors to this fund right now. And then the archery element is there. It's really important. But many people aren't aware of just the diversity of the funding sources coming in. It's very robust, as the video in the upfront talked about. So what does it mean to have this kind of funding? As John said, in a predictable equation through the timeline that you see in the background here. I just wanted to draw your attention to this report called the State Conservation Machine, produced by AFWA in 2017. So it lists state fish and wildlife agencies as having over 50,000 staff. 25% of those staff are degreed biologists. 25% are volunteers or temporary staff. And with state fish and wildlife agencies, 40 to 70% of their budget are from wildlife restoration funding or sport fish restoration funding. In the WISPR program, there's 169 of us that work collaboratively with those biologists in the state agency. We have 68 biologists supporting them. But that's a very diverse workforce and literally an army of very skilled, trained professionals to achieve conservation. And we all look differently than we did 15 years ago in terms of agency programs, expansion of mission, the type of programs that are out there, the type of research grants that universities and co-op units are doing under these funding sources. But it's a very powerful equation for conservation. So I want to just link this to a proposed amendment to this law, which is RAWA, which many people are hearing about now. RAWA is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's an active bill. It's based on expanding the type of species and to meet the needs and other elements that state fish and wildlife agencies need to do. It's based off of state wildlife grants and evaluations that AFWA's done to really demonstrate what that need is. But the reality is it's not a new law. It's changing a very successful existing conservation law. And so it really builds on 8 decades of success in delivering funds for conservation. And I'd encourage you that the TWS is engaged in this act. And if you're interested, you can reach out to TWS. Last thing I wanted to cover was the Wildlife Society does offer 2 awards annually related to grant projects that are highlighted wildlife restoration funded projects. So if you or your colleagues work on these grants, or you know somebody that does, the deadline is May 1st. The Hunting, Trapping, Conservation Working Group really wants to expand the awareness of these 2 awards. They're in the portfolio of awards TWS gives, but there's no monetary element to them. But if you really want to highlight the good work that somebody's doing or you're doing, there's an avenue to do that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Jerry Ann, to continue.
All right, thank you so much for that kind of foundation and history and where we came from. And we can start diving into some questions here. Don't forget, if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A box. I believe if you put it in the chat, we will not be able to see it. Grace early on asked, why does this act apply only to birds and mammals? Was it related to what species of interest were hunted? Now, I don't think any of us were alive in the 30s, but do we have any knowledge, Tom or John, about the motivation behind focusing on birds and mammals with this act early on?
I think, early on, the concept was a user pay, user benefit program where the focus was on game species. And most of the game species that were considered were birds and mammals. But from the beginning, non-game or unhunted species were eligible for grant funding. Many states chose not to prioritize those, and they chose to spend, the Pittman-Robertson funds on species that were hunted and trapped, just based on the agency preferences.
Yeah, that aligns with one of the comments from one of our state agency biologists in the Q&A about Alaska still prioritizes the species that are hunted and trapped.
Yeah,
Kyle,
those are state choices. The words game and non-game don't occur in the act. They came about later in our own cultural part of our profession. But we actually have a letter from Aldo Leopold to Albert Day, like the 2nd year after the act was passed, asking if it was only for species he called of gunpowder value. And Albert Day was the head of what is now the WISPR program, said, no, it's not. It's very broad. I think the megafauna that disappeared off the plains and out of the eastern forest were very apparent birds and mammals. And people really weren't thinking reptiles, amphibians, newts and salamanders. So I think that's really where a lot of the precipice of prioritization came in from.
That makes sense. The things they saw most obviously in front of them going away were then the things they thought about first to bring back. Kyla, we have a question for you. I think approximately how many project proposals are submitted or reviewed every year, and who takes care of all of that?
It's a great question, and I don't know the exact answer of how many proposals the Fish and Wildlife Service and the WISFR program receive. It's really dependent on the state and how they choose to manage their grants. For instance, in the Midwest region, Illinois does a project by project grant where every research project, every O&M project is done separately in its own grant. We also have states that are under a comprehensive management system where they'll submit basically one massive grant that includes all of their work. So it really depends on state. If I had to guess, I would say over 1,000 annually across the states.
And who's reviewing them? Is that you and people like you? How many of you exist in the world?
Yeah, so those people are like me. We're fish and wildlife biologists. Each of us have our own kind of expertise. Tom and I obviously are both wildlife people, but we work directly with fishery management folks too, that kind of manage the other side of the house and the Dingle Johnson program. But from a fish and wildlife side, we're the people that receive those grants first, and we'll work directly with our state partners to kind of massage out any questions we may have and then go about through the approval process. By the time the states bring us those grants, though, they have gone through several revisions at the state level and reflect state priorities.
How many states do you see project proposals from?
I work with the 8 states in the Midwest region, so Ohio, kind of west to Missouri and up to Minnesota, Great Lakes.
And Kim, you're a biologist at Vermont. Do you know how Vermont does yours? How many grants do you, like, is yours itemized or are you a comprehensive grant state?
Well, Tom may be able to answer this better than I can, but my sense is that we lump our projects. We have a wormer project, what we call a wormer project, which has all of our turkey project, deer, moose, and small mammals under that particular grant. And then there's a separate fur bearer project. I don't know how many more there are, Tom, besides that. But
and you have your WMA management project,
right, and the regulatory review project. So we have habitat projects and species projects, but we tend to lump the species projects
Together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what Indiana is moving toward, at least. Now a lot of us species specifics are going onto one grant. We've had several questions about if there's any proposals or development on funds coming in from non-hunting outdoor recreation goods, such as camping equipment or binoculars. Does anybody have, maybe Tom or John, have you heard anything in the works about kind of expanding this to other types of equipment?
There were a number of proposals in the last couple of decades to do that. Some folks might remember one that was called Teaming with Wildlife in the late 90s that had a lot of support, but ultimately didn't get any traction in Congress. And that's what kind of shifted the focus to what became the state and tribal wildlife grants program, and now the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Which doesn't rely on that type of an excise tax funding source. It's just a congressional appropriation rather than tying it to some funding stream. So those taxing outdoor recreation things really didn't, while they gathered a lot of popular support, they didn't seem to gather a lot of industry support. There was a lot of debate over what the appropriate tax rate would be for binoculars versus an RV, say.
Anything to add, anybody else? Okay, somebody asked about more definition about the connection between the Wildlife Restoration Act and the RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, because they weren't aware of the connection that might be there. And as people might be working on trying to garner support for RAWA, they thought it would be helpful for them to understand that connection better. So what is the legislative connection of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act to the Wildlife Restoration Act?
Well, if you look at the beginning of the legislation for RAWA, it clearly states in the first few lines, this is an amendment to the Wildlife Restoration Act. It's not establishing a separate piece of legislation on its own. It's an amendment, which was last amended in 2019. So it brings in, RAWA is a little more complicated. It has its, John went over sort of the formula for allocation of the wildlife restoration funds as is. The amendment here, which the funding source won't be the excise tax, it's some other tax dollars, but it has a more intricate application. I think there's 5 criteria for awarding the monies out to the states. But the linkage is it's amending an existing law as opposed to establishing a new one. And then it has a whole bunch of criteria and eligibility. It increases and expands eligibility for education and some other things that aren't totally funded under the existing Wildlife Restoration Act. So it has its sort of own package, but it's an amendment.
Okay, hopefully that helped answer that. Someone, actually more than one people, asked about if anyone has a feel for proportion of funding that goes to kind of the more heritage or non-game side versus the traditional game species. Is that easy to quantify or is that pretty challenging? Kyle, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think that is challenging in many ways. I'm of the opinion that, you know, some of these divisions of game and non-game are kind of maybe defined within our own profession. But really, when you're looking at these grants across the landscape, you know, acquisition, habitat management, a variety of things that are done under these grant programs benefit all wildlife species. They benefit, you know, clean air, clean water, just a variety of things. But there is a typical like tinge to putting more emphasis on those hunted species, at least in the Midwest states. The traditional survey efforts, the research efforts, obviously started, you know, back in the 50s, 60s and beyond, for turkeys, bear, you know, game birds, etc. So those things are living on within Pittman-Robertson funding. There are, you know, breeding bird surveys and a variety of other surveys for you know, non-game that are included as well.
Jerry Ann, I was just going to add, we've looked at this and we're probably typical of many other states. About 70 to 75% of our wildlife division staff time goes towards just exactly what Kyle was talking about: habitat acquisition, management, and regulatory work that we do with development projects to protect wildlife habitat. And granted, I mean, it benefits game and quote unquote game and non-game species, but a lot of our time is spent on efforts that do benefit a broad range of ecosystem services.
Thanks, Kim. Tom, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I would just, that was the example I was thinking of. Vermont has some special habitat called deer yard, which is where deer move to in the winter. And their biologists will protect deer yard under various strategies, including acquisition. But they have 168 species of birds and mammals that use a deer yard once it's bought as habitat. And so that's why to the question originally, it becomes really hard to say, well, you know, while it was bought in the eligible portion, so many other species are benefiting. And when a state has a Christmas bird count survey or a statewide mammal atlas or a statewide bird atlas that's counting 300 species, it's really broad, but then they still have, you know, a woodcock singing ground survey, which is a different grant. So it's really hard to quantify because the benefits are really ubiquitous in the habitat grant. They are.
Yeah, that's very true. We had a pretty specific question, maybe Kyle or Tom, do you know where there's an exhaustive list of items that are allowable under grant coordination? Does that exist? It may not.
I don't know if there's an exhaustible list for just grant coordination. Typically, the way I see it here in the Midwest is those are the people at the state level that are kind of doing the administrative work to get these grants up to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they're kind of collecting those, making sure that they're doing internal reviews and then coming to Fish and Wildlife Service. That's how I see the grant coordination kind of realm funded here.
The thing that makes that a hard question as well is in every grant evaluation, what John described as reasonable and necessary costs. So you can have an item that's, quote, eligible to buy, but not in this grant. There's no need to have a snowmobile in a grant in Florida, right? Even though a snowmobile is an eligible grant for a project Kim might be running, you know, in Vermont. So, and then there aren't just holistic, like you can't buy certain items. There are a few like that related to drones and some other things related to technology, but there's no exhaustive list. And every grant looks at the equipment being purchased as being needed to meet the objectives of the grant. So something could be allowed in one grant and, you know, the person 2 doors down doesn't get that allowed in their grant because for that grant, they don't need it.
Thanks. We're starting to run out of time. It's getting close to 4 o'clock. So I was wondering about ending on, or possibly ending on, a question we had about, you know, with Congress always looking to fund other projects, and always the possibility of money going elsewhere. What are some of the threats to our wildlife restoration funding? And this ties in directly, Tom, I want you to start with this one because this ties in directly to what question I have. And the great thing about being the moderator is I get to make sure I get my question in here before we're done. You had thrown a term out when we were planning this called slippage, which I had never heard of in my life. So as we talk about challenges and kind of go around to everybody what you think potential challenges and threats that wildlife restoration funding might face in the future, Tom, can you start out by explaining to me what slippage is when it comes to wildlife restoration funds? Because I didn't know that word when you used it.
Yeah, and I'll do it quickly, but slippage is a phenomenon. Normally, these taxes are paid by the manufacturer. So the companies themselves pay the tax at the wholesale level when they're shipping. Slippage is a phenomena whereby companies, particularly outside the US, make a sale through Amazon to somebody directly in their household and they avoid the 11% tax. They don't pay it at all. And the people buying, where I'm buying my archery arrows from, is not taxed. Where Kyle is buying his from, they are taxed. And that phenomenon happens particularly on the archery products and a lot of the angling products, rods and reels. And it relates to tens of millions of dollars in lost revenue. And it puts the people paying the tax at a really competitive disadvantage. So some of the trade associations and the state agencies are trying to address that phenomena whereby Amazon and a couple other companies are not paying the tax.
Thanks. Kim, what do you think are some future challenges or threats that the Wildlife Restoration Act might face as a biologist? What are some of the things you guys are talking about internally?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I have to start by just saying that as everybody has said, it's been a bedrock amount of a bedrock of funding for us. I mean, we couldn't have done all the restoration work and the habitat work that we've done in the last 30, 40, 50 years without these funds. And what I see happening now is that we have more public scrutiny over how we use these funds and the direction that we're going. And in and of itself, that's a good thing. But what's coming along with that is a lot of divisiveness and polarization that I'm afraid might undermine the act going forward. So I think trying to improve the way our inclusiveness, which we've been trying to do, moving forward so that we can continue to spend these funds to do the important work that all state agencies and federal agencies and private entities are doing.
Kyle, real quick, we're running out of time. 15 seconds or less. Challenges.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, what's nice about the Piven-Robertson Act is that it has been updated, fairly frequently through time and gotten bipartisan support to do that. So I think it is it's lagging, but it's keeping up with societal changes. Something that's been mentioned a lot in the questions are hunting numbers. And a lot of times it's the state funding side that we're seeing a boom in Piven-Robertson dollars federally. And can the states keep up with their match if their match is coming from hunting licenses?
Absolutely. John?
I guess one of the things that I'm afraid of is kind of like maybe something that Kim talked about is that, the act can always be amended and not always in a good way. And one of the threats, I think, is just the scale of the dollars in this program versus federal expenditures, right? So the federal budget last year was almost $4 trillion. In the entire 80+ year history of this act, it's only collected about $20 billion in excise tax revenues, maybe a little bit more than 20 billion. So that's big money to people like us who got by on a few $1,000s in grad school. But in terms of federal expenditures, $1 billion, even though last year's receipts were $1 billion, that's a rounding error in the federal budget. So you could get an ambitious congressman or senator who wants to amend the act to exert a lot more control. And while it would be a big deal to us and all the people who work in state fish and wildlife agencies, there may not be enough support out there to fight off that type of amendment.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. The Hunting, Trapping, Conservation Working Group does have a website, and we have an email on there. So if you had a burning question we didn't get to, you can feel free to email us, and we'll try to get an answer to you later. But I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and for being with us, and thank you to the panel for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us as well. So I hope everybody has a good rest of your day. And this will be posted if you want to share it with anybody here in about a week or so. It should be on the Wildlife Society's page. Well, thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.